What happens when a CEO, frustrated with rising complaints about his company's factory conditions, decides to go undercover to see the truth for himself? The CEO, a man in his late 40s named Mark, had built his company from scratch, starting with a single product in a small garage. Now, it had expanded to a chain of factories across 3 states, employing hundreds of workers. But lately, the reports crossing his desk were troubling. High turnover rates, complaints of unsafe conditions, and whispers of employees feeling undervalued. Mark had tried addressing these issues through management, but the answers always felt rehearsed, too polished to be entirely truthful. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Disguised with a scruffy beard, glasses, and wearing old, faded clothes, Mark donned the identity of Mike, a new temp worker. He had never personally met the staff at this particular factory. It was one of the larger ones, with over 200 employees, and he knew his appearance wouldn't raise any alarms. Plus, he'd informed HR to expect a new temp hire, giving him cover. As soon as he stepped into the factory, the noise hit him like a wall. Machines hummed, metal clanged, and people shouted instructions over the din. The floor manager, a wiry man named Carl, greeted him brusquely. "You're the new guy, great. Don't slow us down." No handshake, no small talk, just a clipboard shoved into Mark's hands with a list of tasks. Mark nodded, keeping his head low. "Sure thing, boss." Carl barely looked up. Yeah, get moving." Mark's first task was simple: packaging finished products. He worked alongside a small group of employees, all of them focused and quick. One young woman, Sarah, seemed particularly efficient, her hands flying as she taped and stacked boxes. Despite the speed of her work, she still managed to smile at Mark and give him a quick rundown of how things were done. "Don't worry," she said, her voice kind but tinged with exhaustion. "First day's always rough. Just watch out for Carl, he's not exactly patient," Mark chuckled nervously. "I've noticed." As the hours passed, Mark began to see cracks in the operation. Equipment was outdated and prone to jamming, forcing workers to either stop entirely or risk injury by fixing it themselves. Breaks were rushed, with Carl barking at anyone who lingered too long. But what struck him the most was the tension in the air. People worked hard, but there was no sense of pride or camaraderie. Everyone seemed worn down, like they were just trying to survive the day. Then it happened. Mark was walking past one of the assembly lines when he heard a voice, trembling and desperate, coming from behind a stack of crates. "Please, I need help. I can't keep up." He froze. The voice belonged to an older man, maybe in his late 50s, sitting on the floor with his back against a crate. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his temples. He clutched his chest, breathing heavily. Mark crouched down immediately. "Hey, are you okay? What's going on?" The man shook his head, clearly in distress. "I told Carl I needed a break. My chest hurts. He said to finish the shift or not come back." Mark's stomach twisted. "Stay here. I'm getting help." He rushed to Carl, who was leaning against a forklift, scrolling on his phone. "Carl, one of the workers is in bad shape." Carl didn't even look up. "If it's Frank, he's always complaining. He'll be fine. Get back to work." Mark's jaw tightened. "He's not fine. He's struggling to breathe." Carl sighed dramatically, shoving his phone into his pocket. "Fine, I'll call someone, but you," he pointed at Mark. "Get back to your station." Mark hesitated, anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he nodded and returned to Frank. He stayed with the man until the on-site medic arrived, watching as Frank was helped to his feet and taken to the infirmary. The look in Frank's eyes, gratitude mixed with shame, stayed with Mark long after he returned to work. By the end of the shift, Mark's hands were blistered, his back ached, and his mind raced. The conditions were worse than he'd imagined, and Carl's indifference was infuriating. But it wasn't just Carl. The entire system felt broken. Employees like Sarah and Frank deserved better. As he packed up for the day, Sarah walked by and gave him a tired smile. "You did good today, Mike. Hope to see you tomorrow." Mark forced a smile, but inside he was already planning his next steps. He wasn't just coming back tomorrow, he was going to dig deeper. And when the time came, he would make things right. The next morning, Mark arrived at the factory early, blending in with the stream of workers clocking in for their shifts. The air was cool, but the atmosphere was as heavy as the day before. Conversations were hushed, mostly complaints about long hours or malfunctioning equipment. Mark, still disguised as Mike, stuck close to the group he'd worked with the previous day. He was determined to dig deeper into the root of the factory's issues. Carl was already on the floor, clipboard in hand, barking orders at a cluster of workers near the conveyor belt. He spotted Mark and motioned him over without so much as a greeting. "You're on assembly line 3 today," Carl said flatly, barely looking up from his clipboard. "Numbers were down yesterday, so pick it up." "No mistakes, no excuses." Mark nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Got it." Assembly line 3 was notorious, Mark had overheard yesterday, for being one of the most physically demanding stations. Workers were expected to keep up with the relentless pace of the machinery, and breakdowns were frequent. Sure enough, when Mark arrived, he saw Sarah already there, her sleeves rolled up, hands moving with practiced precision as she managed the line. "Mike," she greeted him with a tired smile. "Welcome to the fun zone." Mark gave her a small grin. "Looks like I picked the right day to be here." Sarah laughed lightly, but there was a weariness in her eyes. "Just keep up the pace." Carl's been on a warpath since last week's numbers dropped. As the hours ticked by, Mark saw firsthand the strain the job put on the workers. The line moved at a grueling speed, and the slightest mistake caused a chain reaction that Carl was quick to pounce on. At one point, a young man named Lewis accidentally dropped a component, causing a brief delay. Carl stormed over, his face twisted in anger. "Lewis," he shouted, "what the hell are you doing? You think this is recess? Get it together or I'll find someone who can." Lewis muttered an apology, his hands trembling as he scrambled to catch up. Mark clenched his fists, biting back the urge to intervene. He needed to stay undercover for now to see just how far this went. By lunchtime, Mark noticed Sarah sitting alone at a table in the corner of the break room, her head resting on her hand. He grabbed his tray and joined her. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She glanced up and nodded. "Just tired. You get used to it after a while." "Do you?" Mark asked, his tone gentle but probing. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "Not really, but I need this job. My kid starts school next month and I can't afford to lose it." Mark felt a pang of guilt. He had no idea how many people in his company were struggling just to get by. "What about Carl? Does he always ride people so hard?" Sarah glanced around, lowering her voice. Carl. He's been here forever. Management ignores him because he keeps the numbers up, but people quit all the time because of him." She paused, then added, "Not that it matters." "They just replace us with temps." Mark frowned. "That's no way to treat people." Sarah shrugged. "It's the way it is." Before Mark could respond, the breakroom door slammed open and Carl strode in. "Lunch is over in 5 minutes," he barked. "Let's go, people." Mark watched as Sarah quickly finished her meal and left, her shoulders slumped. He stayed behind a moment, staring at the half-eaten food on his tray. The weight of what he was witnessing was starting to sink in. Later that afternoon, Mark was sent to help with machine maintenance, a task he'd been dreading. He had no experience with the equipment and was paired with an older worker named Joe, who seemed perpetually on edge. "Just follow my lead," Joe muttered as they approached the massive, clanking machine. Mark nodded, but within minutes, it was clear the machine was in bad shape. Joe cursed under his breath as he wrestled with a jammed component, sweat pouring down his face. "This thing's a death trap," Joe muttered. "I've told Carl 100 times it needs replacing, but he doesn't give a damn." Mark frowned. "What happens if it breaks?" Joe shot him a grim look. "Pray you're not standing too close." It wasn't long before the machine jammed again, forcing Joe to climb inside to fix it. Mark stood nearby, uneasy as the heavy gears groaned and shuddered. "Careful," Mark said. Joe waved him off. "I've done this 1,000,000 times." Suddenly, the machine lurched, and Joe let out a yelp as his hand was caught between two gears. Mark reacted instinctively, hitting the emergency stop button and rushing to help. "Joe," Mark shouted, "are you okay?" Joe winced, cradling his injured hand. "It's fine." "Just a scratch." But it wasn't fine. Blood seeped through his fingers and his face was pale. Mark helped him to his feet, his heart pounding. Carl arrived moments later, his expression annoyed. "What now?" "Joe's hurt," Mark said firmly. "He needs medical attention," Carl scoffed. "It's just a scrape, get back to work." Mark stepped forward, his voice sharper than he intended. "No." "He's going to the infirmary." "Now," Carl sneered. "Since when do you give orders?" Mark stared him down, his patience wearing thin. "Since someone's safety is on the line." For a moment, Carl looked like he might argue, but then he waved dismissively. "Fine, take him. But don't expect any sympathy when you fall behind." As Mark helped Joe to the infirmary, he knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. Carl's behavior wasn't just harsh, it was dangerous. Something had to change. And soon. Mark returned to the factory floor after ensuring Joe was properly treated in the infirmary. The atmosphere felt even heavier than before. Workers avoided eye contact with Carl, who stalked the floor like a hawk, clipboard in hand, shouting at anyone who looked like they might fall behind. Mark could see the fear etched into everyone's faces. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the weight of working under someone who saw them as nothing but numbers. But Mark wasn't here to sit quietly anymore. His decision was made. He'd seen enough to know that the factory's culture was broken, and it started at the top of the local leadership. He needed to confront Carl, but not yet. Instead, he would spend the rest of the shift gathering more insight from the workers Carl had been ignoring or pushing around. He wanted to hear their stories firsthand. As Mark moved to his next assigned task, unloading heavy boxes from a delivery truck, a familiar face approached. Lewis, the young man Carl had berated earlier, offered a hesitant smile as he grabbed a box from the truck bed. "Hey, Mike," Lewis said quietly. "Tough first couple of days, huh?" Mark nodded, setting a box down on a nearby pallet. "Yeah, tough's one way to put it. Does it ever get easier?" Lewis shrugged. "Not really, but you get used to it." "I guess." Mark hesitated, then asked, "What brought you here? If you don't mind me asking," Lewis sighed, resting a hand on the truck for support. "My mom got sick last year. Medical bills piled up and, well, college wasn't an option anymore. I needed a paycheck fast and they were hiring temps. Figured it'd be temporary, but here I am." Mark frowned. "You planning to stick around?" Lewis gave a bitter laugh. "I don't know. I mean, I'd like to, but Carl makes it hard. He's always on me like I'm some screw-up. Some days I think about walking out, but my mom depends on me, you know." He shook his head. "Not like anyone listens to us anyway. Management doesn't care as long as the work gets done." Mark felt a pang of guilt again. Lewis was right, no one had been listening. And that included him, sitting in his corporate office miles away, trusting reports from people like Carl instead of seeing the truth for himself. He placed a hand on Lewis's shoulder. "Hang in there. Things can change." Lewis gave him a puzzled look but nodded. "Thanks, Mike, appreciate it." As the day dragged on, Mark watched Carl grow more irritable. Anytime a machine slowed or someone asked a question, Carl would storm over, snapping and waving his clipboard like a weapon. But it wasn't just his temper, it was his complete disregard for the workers' well-being. At one point, Mark overheard Carl laughing with another supervisor about how easy it was to replace temps. "They're a dime a dozen," Carl said with a smirk. "They should be grateful they've got jobs at all." Mark's jaw tightened. He wanted to confront him then and there, but he knew it wasn't the right moment. Instead, he spent the rest of the shift observing, taking mental notes of every broken machine, every unfair reprimand, and every worker like Louis and Sarah who deserved better. By the time the day ended, Mark's body was sore, but his mind was racing. He couldn't let another day go by without taking action. He waited until most of the workers had left for the evening, then approached Sarah as she was clocking out. "Hey, Sarah," he said. "Got a minute?" She looked surprised but nodded. "Sure." "What's up?" Mark hesitated, then said, "You've been here a while, right? You know how things work around here." Sarah crossed her arms, giving him a wary look. "Yeah." "Why, I'm just trying to understand," he said carefully. "Why does everyone put up with Carl? Why hasn't anyone gone to upper management about him?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "You think they'd listen?" "Carl's been here forever. He's got the numbers to show off, and that's all they care about. Even if someone did complain, they'd just get labeled as a troublemaker." "Trust me, it's not worth it." Mark nodded slowly. "What if things could change? What if someone higher up actually listened?" Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "What are you getting at, Mike?" Mark hesitated but didn't answer. "Just thinking out loud. Thanks for talking to me." As Sarah walked away, Mark knew the time for subtlety was over. He'd seen enough, heard enough, and felt enough to know that this factory and the people in it deserved better. It was time to reveal who he was and make things right. The next morning, Mark arrived at the factory early again, but this time he wasn't wearing his disguise. He walked into the main office dressed sharply in a suit, his real identity on full display. The receptionist looked up from her desk, startled. "Good morning," Mark said calmly. "I'm Mark, the CEO of this company. I need to speak with Carl." "Now," the receptionist stammered, then hurriedly picked up the phone. Within minutes, Carl appeared, looking confused and slightly annoyed until his eyes landed on Mark. His face paled. Mr. "Mark," Carl stuttered. "What brings you here?" Mark's expression was calm but firm. "We need to talk, privately." Carl nodded quickly, leading him to a small office near the back. As soon as the door closed, Mark turned to face him. "I've been working undercover in this factory for the past few days," Mark said evenly. "I've seen how you treat the employees. I've seen the conditions they're working under, and I've seen enough." Carl's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I can explain." "No," Mark cut him off, his voice rising. "There's nothing to explain. Your behavior is unacceptable. You've created a toxic environment where employees are afraid to even ask for help. You've ignored safety concerns, berated hard-working people, and treated them like they're disposable. That ends now." Carl's face turned red. "But the numbers don't matter if people are getting hurt," Mark snapped. "Effective immediately, you're being terminated. Security will escort you out." Carl's shoulders slumped, and for once he was silent. Mark opened the door, signaling for a guard to take him away. As Carl was led out, Mark stepped onto the factory floor, gathering the workers' attention. "Everyone," he called out, his voice carrying over the hum of machinery. "I'm Mark, the CEO of this company. I've been working here undercover, and I've seen the challenges you face every day. That's going to change." The room fell silent, workers exchanging stunned glances. "I'm implementing immediate changes," Mark continued. "New equipment, better safety protocols, and more breaks. And for those of you who have been going above and beyond, Louis, Sarah, Joe, I'll be meeting with you personally to discuss promotions and pay raises. You deserve it." For the first time, Mark saw something new in their faces: hope. The factory erupted into cautious applause, and Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a start. This time, he would make sure no one was left unheard again. The following week, Mark returned to the factory. This time, he wasn't undercover. He arrived early in the morning, dressed casually but without the disguise, and walked straight onto the factory floor. Workers paused mid-task, their eyes widening as they recognized him. Whispers spread quickly. "That's the CEO, he's back." Mark raised his hand to quiet the murmurs. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I know a lot has happened over the past few days, and I'm here to talk about what's next. I made promises, and I intend to keep every single one of them." The workers stopped what they were doing, gathering around him in cautious curiosity. Mark noticed Sarah standing toward the front of the group. Her arms crossed, but her expression softer than the last time they'd spoken. Louis was nearby, holding a clipboard, looking both nervous and hopeful. Joe stood off to the side, his bandaged hand resting on a railing. "I've made some changes," Mark continued. "Let me walk you through them." He motioned for everyone to follow him as he headed toward the main assembly line. "First, the outdated equipment you've been working with is being replaced as we speak. New machines are already on their way. I've also hired a full-time maintenance team to ensure that nothing like what happened to Joe ever happens again." Joe's eyes widened. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Mark nodded. "Dead serious. Safety comes first, always." Several workers exchanged glances, their skepticism melting into cautious optimism. Mark led them to the break room next. "Second, I've revised the break schedule. You'll now have 2 15-minute breaks and a full 30-minute lunch break every shift. And nobody," he added, his tone sharp, "nobody will be penalized for taking the time they need to rest." Sarah's hand shot up. "What about Carl?" she asked bluntly. "What's stopping the next manager from treating us the same way?" Mark smiled faintly. "Good question. Carl is gone, and I'm bringing in someone who understands what leadership really means." He gestured to the doorway as a woman in a crisp button-down shirt stepped inside. "This is Maria. She's your new floor manager." Maria stepped forward, her voice steady but warm. "I've been with this company for 12 years, starting as a line worker like many of you. I know the challenges you face, and I'm here to make sure you're heard and supported. My door will always be open." The room buzzed with quiet conversation. Sarah nodded approvingly while Louis gave Maria a small wave, his shoulders relaxing. Mark wasn't finished, though. "Now let's talk about the people who have gone above and beyond," he said, turning to face the group. Sarah stepped forward. Sarah blinked in surprise but stepped forward cautiously, her hands fidgeting. "Me?" she asked. Mark smiled. "You've worked here for years, training new employees, keeping things running smoothly, and staying positive even in tough times. Starting today, you're being promoted to shift supervisor. You'll also receive a pay raise and additional benefits." Sarah's jaw dropped. "Are you serious?" she whispered. "Completely," Mark said, extending his hand. She shook it, her voice trembling. "Thank you, I don't know what to say." "You've earned it," Mark replied simply. "And Louis," he said, turning to the younger worker, "you've shown dedication to this job despite the challenges in your personal life. I'm covering your mom's medical bills through our employee support program, effective immediately." Louis's clipboard clattered to the floor. "What? Are you kidding me?" Tears welled up in his eyes as he stepped forward, struggling to find the words. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "Take care of your mom." "That's what matters." Finally, Mark turned to Joe. "And Joe, I know you've been here a long time. You've kept this place running even when the odds were against you. I'm giving you a paid leave to recover fully and a bonus to thank you for your years of service." Joe's face flushed red as he nodded, his voice cracking. "Thank you, sir. Really." Mark stepped back, addressing the group as a whole. "This is just the beginning. I'm setting up an employee feedback system so you can share your concerns directly with me and the leadership team. No more being ignored, no more being treated like you don't matter. The room erupted into applause this time, louder and more genuine. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked out at the faces of his employees. They weren't just workers to him anymore. They were people with stories, struggles, and dreams. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached him, her expression thoughtful. I mean, Mark," she said with a small smile. "Why did you do all of this? You could have just stayed in your office and let things run as they were." Mark's smile faded slightly. "Because I forgot what it was like to be on the ground. I let the reports and numbers blind me to what was really happening. That's my fault. I won't let it happen again." Sarah nodded slowly. "Well, you've got my respect." "And trust me, that's not easy to earn," Mark chuckled. "I'll take it." As he left the factory that day, Mark felt lighter than he had in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let himself get so disconnected again. His employees deserved better, and now they were going to get it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a true leader.